So Ron, to kind of begin, compared to how we actually finished our last webinar, there was a little bit of a question as to who may or may not be the next president of the United States and how that would impact certainly U.S. policy and strategic direction in the Middle East and Israel in particular. At this point, I think it's relatively safe to say that we will have a Joe Biden administration that will take over at the end of January. Just to kind of get us started, the past 4 years have been very remarkable under this administration. And I say that irrespective of whether you love Donald Trump, hate Donald Trump, you like his domestic policies and views, or you despise them, the way in which his administration and the people he's empowered to be part of that administration, as far as their dealings with Israel, is very, very contrary to anything that we have seen in recent decades and arguably in the history of the United States and certainly the history of the state of Israel. Whether that deals with moving the embassy to Jerusalem, whether that deals with recognizing Israel's control of the Golan Heights. And obviously this has a broader impact in terms of Israel's international relations. And certainly its focus on bringing Israel and Arab countries together. With this new administration, I think a lot of people are concerned as to, is this going to be a radical and immediate departure from some of these policies? And for a lot of people who feel that way, I would actually kind of advise you to for those that are really concerned or happy about the situation of what's going to be coming, I feel many of them are going to be disappointed in different ways. That we recently had Seth Frantzman on for one of our webinars. He's the Middle East Affairs Analyst for the Jerusalem Post. And when we kind of posited this question to him, like, what do you anticipate from a Biden administration that might be different from a Trump administration as it deals with Israel, as it deals with the Middle East? The analogy that he used that I thought was beautiful and I want to reintroduce here was that he referred to foreign policy in that regard in terms of strategic interests as a cruise ship or an oil tanker, a very large ship, that even if you really like the captain of the ship and that captain happens to be replaced by someone you don't like, this is such a large and slow moving vehicle that the ability of a captain that you perceive to be hostile or that you don't agree with, for them to radically depart from the direction of that ship is virtually impossible to do. We've seen certain policies that have been a long time coming and a change in direction in the region that did not start with Donald Trump, did not start with Barack Obama, and they are not going to suddenly revert back just because Joe Biden is in office. Whether that is Israel's budding, first covert and now overt relationship with the Gulf states. We saw the Abraham Accords recently, and actually we will touch upon the fact that the Bahraini foreign minister is in Israel, which is something remarkable, something we haven't seen arguably since Anwar Sadat addressed the Knesset back in the 1970s. But also just due to the realignment of the Middle East and certainly America's position of not wanting to be policemen of the world and in the Middle East in particular, I don't think we're going to see such a radical shift to what may have preceded this administration and some things that people are concerned about. Ron, what are your thoughts about that assessment and what do you think we may see in the developing years under a new administration?
I think Frantzman's analogy there was interesting and quite accurate. Biden has good instincts on Israel. He really does. I'd like to share one story with the audience that I got from someone who was in the room when some of the decisions were being made on Israel during the Obama administration. And this individual who happened to be in the room told me that time and time again, Biden was on Israel's side because those were his natural instincts. Now, there were many of those conversations that were happening behind closed door where Obama, disagreed with Joe Biden and may have done the opposite. But the point being, to Justin's point, is that Biden has good instincts on Israel. We shouldn't expect to see, given the analogy that this ship is going to do a 180 turn. Biden is not going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. Biden is not, I don't believe he's going to renounce Israel's sovereignty or claim over the Golan Heights. Things that I think we will see, and I don't think can attribute it more to Biden, maybe more the Democratic Party in general, is we haven't heard a word about settlements in 4 years. I think it's safe to assume that issue, and again, it changes from administration to administration, from the president, whether he's the same party or different party, but that issue will percolate, I believe, back to the top. We'll probably hear more about settlements. But I agree, I don't think we'll see a major change. I think the thing that I am most worried about is the JCPOA. You hear that he wants to get back into the deal. I would have no problem engaging Iran in negotiations, as the Trump administration has been open to doing for the last 4 years. Re-entering the agreement as is isn't possible because Iran has done things over the last 6 months to a year, which would no longer be compliant in the deal in its original form. Would we re-enter the deal if they were to curtail these certain violations? I don't know, but I would be most concerned about engagement with Iran. We tried diplomacy with Iran. We tried appeasement with Iran. It just didn't work. You could have been for it, against it. But now that the 4, 5, 8, 9 years has passed, we know that appeasement doesn't work. It's dangerous to our allies. It's dangerous to the people living in the region. So that's the thing that I'm personally going to be watching most closely is how is the Biden administration going to handle Iran over the next 4 years?
To kind of add to that, or, as a follow-up, when we see this type of transition of power in the United States from, what's kind of referred to as a sitting duck or lame duck presidency, in which, the term is effectively over, but the president is still the president for a 2-month period, that is an opportunity for, the departing POTUS to kind of leave his mark, her mark eventually, and to make certain policy decisions. Under the Obama administration, we saw that as far as not exercising that veto regarding Israeli settlements at the United Nations. I think one of the concerns right now for some people is, are we going to see the Trump administration, are we going to see Israel take certain action to change the facts on the ground before a change in administration, potentially a change in policy and doctrine, as it pertains to Iran's nuclear program, or certainly its presence throughout the Middle East in such a belligerent manner. There was an article that came out the other day about one of the high-ranking members of al-Qaeda that was assassinated by an Israeli Mossad squad in Tehran. Over the past near decade at this point, Israel has struck without mercy and, thankfully with authority, different Iranian elements and Hezbollah elements on the Syrian border and even in Lebanon for that matter, such as was the case a few nights ago, if I'm not mistaken. Do you foresee there being a possibility that the United States, Israel, or even as a collective may strike some of Iran's nuclear infrastructure within the next few months or the next few weeks while before this term expires?
Anything is possible. It's 2020, right?
Yeah.
I don't believe it's funny. I've been seeing a lot about that. The Business Insider had an article quoting some high-ranking security officials about some action taking place towards the end here. I personally don't believe it. I don't see something that drastic happening in the next 60 days. But I would say that anything, especially in the Middle East, anything is possible. But I would put a strike on targets inside Iran, not assassinations, but military strikes within the sovereign country of Iran. I don't pay much heed to that thought.
One other thing I wanted to mention based on your initial response was about the potential change in policy, whether it is material or even just verbally in terms of the form of public international relations and diplomacy, that the Biden administration's policy and sort of overtures regarding Israeli settlements may resemble more previous administrations than the Trump one. One thing that we talk about in Fuel for Truth in boot camp, and I know this is certainly kind of a pain point for a lot of people in their conversations, is when criticism of Israeli settlements comes up, whether it's the debate between are they legal under international law, are they illegal? Does Israel have a legal claim to this territory? Is it occupied? Is it disputed? And obviously all the questions in between. But one of the things that you and I have certainly talked about many times, and certainly we've heard from participants in our programs, is not really understanding the settlement issue in terms of when this is published or when these conversations come up. The idea of Israeli settlements gets painted with such a broad brush that in any report that you see about either tenders being issued or construction beginning, it treats anything beyond what was formerly the 1949 armistice line as all being the same. And I don't think most people know or appreciate that that type of language and certainly that legal definition of what settlements are or are not is just as equally applicable to the Jewish quarter of the old city as it is to the most outlying Jewish community in the West Bank. And so I was hoping you could, and I obviously as well, spend a little time kind of really parsing what is the difference between some of these communities and certainly how they factored in to the policy decisions and considerations of Israel and the United States in previous years.
Yeah, I never understood under the Obama administration the obsession with settlement construction within the 5 blocks. Without getting into a whole long history lesson, most of the construction that takes place in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank happens in territory that, and this is very important, that both the Palestinians and Israeli acknowledge and understand will remain part of Israel.
Ron, before you go ahead, can you just define what the 5 blocks are?
The 5 blocks are 5 major areas that mostly start in Israel, not all of them, and jut into the West Bank. These are not settlements. These are large cities. They're larger than the town or city that I grew up in outside of Syracuse, New York. Some of these cities have 50, 60,000 people. And again, it's been acknowledged by Yasser Arafat, by Abu Mazen, by both sides that these areas, these 5 settlement blocks, and to give you some names, because some of the people on the call probably have either been there or recognize them by name. We're talking about Malay Adumim, Efrat, Ariel, Modin. These are places that are never, ever going to be evacuated. So if Israel's going to build, there was one point in time that during the White House press conference, they condemned Israel for building 94 senior housing units in Malay Adumim. Malay Adumim is a city that will never be part of Palestine. It would never be not part of Israel. And I never understood why they would even take time to condemn such an action. And to even take it further, why would any US administration disagree on something, on one of the very few things that the Palestinians and Israelis actually agree on? So I don't expect Biden to go that far. I really don't. It's certainly possible, and I could be wrong. But I'm hoping that if settlements do percolate to the top, how I believe they will, that will just be it'll be more of an intelligent conversation that they'll be having with Israel, understanding that these areas where Israel's building and where Israel has a presence in the 5 settlement blocks shouldn't be an issue to anyone on planet Earth, because under no circumstances would they ever be part of anything other than Israel. And again, I think the most important point, this is one of the very few things that both sides acknowledge and agree on.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also recognize that when we've talked about prior negotiations, whether during the Oslo period or even afterward, that type of construction was never an actual issue. Meaning that's not what derailed, Oslo and Camp David in the 1990s and in 2000. It certainly wasn't an issue that derailed talks between Israel and Egypt when Sinai settlement construction was going on in the 1970s. Negotiations continued, and in the case of Israel and Egypt, an agreement was eventually signed. And even though Oslo and Camp David collapsed, at the end of the century, it was not because of any particular Israeli community beyond what was the 1949 armistice line. One thing I do want to add, because we did talk about this last night when we had our online boot camp class, we were talking about the refugee issue. And within that, we were very much talking about the role of the United Nations in our conflict. Now, a lot of participants were relaying to me how frustrated they were, how annoying it was, where you see at the UN a resolution being passed that either condemns Israel in some way or targets Israel in particular, especially as far as a proportion of the number of resolutions that get passed on an annual basis at the UN, certainly far more than China, Cuba, Russia, Turkey, whatever hostile actor you want to think of.
Syria, Afghanistan, combined.
Yeah. And so the big thing that I tried to emphasize, and for people to think a little more differently, was that, there's nothing that we can necessarily do to change what goes on at the UN. And I don't want that to be sort of the make or break as to if you should feel positively or negatively by what goes on, but to recalibrate how you understand why this is going on and what is being done. That very often people are viewing what goes on at the UN, specifically toward Israel, as a legal operation from a legal perspective. And therefore, if the UN is telling Israel that it's doing something illegal, or it just happened to collectively vote on this in a very democratic way, one country, one vote to establish, this Israel community is illegal. Israel's action here is illegal. Temple Mount, it's not really Har Habayit. It's Haram al-Sharif and it's Islamic site. the way that you can better approach that situation and digest it is that the UN at the end of the day is a political body. It's designed to deal with international political affairs, not really legal ones. That at the end of the day, while there is consensus in international law, and there's obviously far more detail than I want to get into right now, the point of the UN is to provide a political infrastructure for countries to deal with issues rather than going to war with each other. So when you are dealing with this conversation with people, or when you're thinking about this, when you see those headlines that want to make you pull out your hair, thankfully I don't have any hair to pull out anymore, so it's not an issue for me, is that understand that this is a political situation rather than a legal one. That at the end of the day, this is people exercising their right as a member state of the UN for them to vote either individually or as a bloc for their own political or strategic interests. And that's more often where it begins and where it ends. That General Assembly resolutions at the UN, which the majority of them are merely recommendations. They are not binding in any way whatsoever. They are suggestions for the parties in question to implement on their own. And in the case of our conflict and our history, that includes the partition plan, by the way, UN Resolution 181. It includes the right of return for Palestinians, UN Resolution 194, and also very commonly known, UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. These aren't binding or requirements for Israel, the Palestinians, or any of the Arab countries for that matter. They're merely recommendations. And that's one way I would like and certainly encourage people to think about this a little differently. It'll save you a lot of stress and a lot of time and anger. So we can recalibrate ourselves in any way we can to feel a little better about the situation.
Yeah, the United Nations is the theater of absurdity. And a lot of the stuff that goes on there, the IDF's mantra is, the best defense is a good offense. So a lot of these countries that are guilty of all kinds of crimes against humanity, human rights violations, you go on the offense and you continue to pass resolutions and blame Israel, and there's no time for anyone to really look at themselves in the mirror or do what the bodies are supposed to do and hold those guilty responsible. But that's not really an opportunity. The UN has become an absolute joke. There are some good things that the United Nations does, but allowing countries like Syria, China, North Korea, Iran to even have a voice or a seat at the table, enough said. Enough said.
Yeah, sadly, a lot of the good things the UN does are not the things we actually hear about. We hear about
Correct. And you'll never hear about the good stuff that they do.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be honest for us to dismiss the body as a whole.
Agreed. To kind of shift gears here, but to stay in line with what we were talking about with sort of previous negotiations and certainly the Oslo structure that Israel and the Palestinian Authority have had since the mid-1990s, I think it's one of those things that neither party wants to leave it, but both of them absolutely hate it. And therefore, they're kind of stuck in a framework that neither of them actually wants, but it's also a marriage or a relationship neither is willing to abandon for their own particular strategic interests and for their own concerns. Recently it was announced that the Palestinian Authority, after severing or allegedly severing security cooperation and even civil cooperation with the Israeli government, following the announcement of the Trump plan and certain overtures that were being made, and the Abraham Accords in particular, that now the PA has kind of jumped back in saying, we're going to renew security ties with Israel. Can you talk a little bit about the history of that Israel-PA security cooperation, but also part of how this fits into the overall dysfunction of Israel's relationship with the PA, or how fragile or how unique it is up to this point?
Yeah, well, second on Oslo, Oslo was never meant to be productive as is today. Like the state of Oslo today was supposed to be temporary. It was
Right.
supposed to lead to a final status, but because of action, certainly by Hamas and what was going on in Gaza at the time, the whole thing, and certainly there were parts of that Israel, you can maybe point later down the road at Israel with changing of from labor to Likud. It never held up, and it's been stuck in limbo. And yeah, I would argue that it's not good for either side. But I believe, and I've told you this before, Justin, that one of the only bright spots of Oslo, in my own opinion, is the creation and the establishment and the maintenance of the Palestinian Security Force, which was trained by, I believe, General Allen, a well-respected general in the United States military. It's an effective security force. Is there corruption there? There is no doubt. But the Palestinian Security Force is one of the major obstacles to Hamas strengthening its influence and, in fact, entirely taking over the West Bank. the security cooperation, I mean, people try and paint it as a good for Israel. It's far more critical to the Palestinians to maintain that effective force. And again, I believe that is the only legacy, one of the few legacies of Oslo was the creation of that force and its cooperation with the IDF. It's not a perfect relationship. It is not a perfect unit, but a very valuable one, and one that is good for the Palestinians living on the ground in that area, and certainly good for Israel and its cooperation in fighting terrorism. And that Palestinian security force, again, you hear snippets here and there, has saved many Israeli lives by helping coordinate intelligence and helping the IDF find terror attacks or suspects before they're able to act on their plots. It's one of the few legacies or few bright spots of Oslo.
Not only that, you once in a blue moon, you hear stories about either Israeli civilians or even the IDF for that matter, accidentally going into area A, into down the wrong street. And before they are lynched or something else happens to them, it is the PA security force that gets them out, that saves their lives.
Correct. It's happened more than once.
Yeah. So yeah, it's really
lip service though. In general, you were referencing them re-engaging. Nothing has really changed other than there's a new president coming. So the Palestinians, this is kind of throwing dirt in Trump's face, in my opinion. They're now agreeing to re-engage with Israel. And I think they said Israel told them that they were going to honor their agreements, but nothing's really changed other than who is going to lead the free world starting in 2021 for the next 4 years. And we'll see. Listen, the Abba Eban, you never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Under the Obama administration, they had arguably the most friendly president they will ever have in their history, and they refused to negotiate. What a missed opportunity. They had an ally. They could have gotten more out of Obama for as far as negotiating with the Israelis than anyone on planet Earth in the annals of history. And they refused to negotiate, period. It wasn't like they got down the road or there were certain issues they couldn't get over. They wouldn't negotiate. They're going to have a more friendly year in the White House for sure over the next 4 years. We'll see what they do with it.
Yeah, it's also interesting at a time where they may have a more friendly ear in the White House, they certainly have a less friendly ear as far as their surrounding Arab neighbors. These are countries that now value Israel for their own pragmatic reasons, both in terms of defense strategy against Iranian as well as Turkish threats. But also, let's talk about really conflict here. For all the conflicts that we see in the world, whether historically or even today, that go on, the one thing that transcends even conflict over ethnic, religious, or ideological claims is resources. That brings more people into conflict than anything else. The Middle East, I don't have to tell anyone here, is a very, very dry place. The ability that Israel has for water technology and water recycling, not only was it a hallmark of its agreement with Jordan, but I promise you that water technology is very much embedded in the Abraham Accords and anything else Israel will sign with any other Arab country going forward.
No question. No question. And on that note, on the Abraham Accords, it's you start to see that fruit bear pretty quickly. The foreign minister of Bahrain is in Israel. As Justin mentioned earlier, that's a huge deal that I believe is in Jerusalem as we're talking right now. Also, trade. I believe it was announced within the last few days that an Israeli VC firm made its first large investment in the Gulf region. They were investing, I believe it was in the UAE, if I'm not mistaken. The electric scooters that we see in cities across here, there's a startup company in, I believe it's the UAE, I could be mistaken. And the Israeli VC made a sizable investment in that company. So it's a two-way street. While Israel will benefit, no doubt, because of what you're saying, water, agriculture, cyber, space, military, you'll also see a lot of flowing coming from Israel, not maybe from technology, but dollars to invest in different startups, different industries that the UAE and these other Gulf nations have.
One thing I saw recently, and this was an article a friend sent to me, I think it was in the Jerusalem Post. It was talking about the idea of Israel and the Gulf countries trying to, and I say renew because an existing track work and framework previously existed, certainly during the Ottoman Empire and even during the British Mandate and the French mandates, is that there was a regional rail system that connected all these countries together that the idea of potentially bringing back that type of rail system for obviously human travel and tourism, but overall interconnectivity. And it was talking about how Israel and the Gulf countries were reaching out to the European Union, which supplies a lot of the technology as well as the trains for a lot of these regional or even these national train and rail systems, about effectively recreating that rail work and that framework. And that would be really something to see.
Was Monty Friedman did a beautiful piece in the New York Times in the last year about that. He went around Israel uncovering what was left of some of the infrastructure that used to exist connecting the British and Ottoman Empire. Obviously, as borders were created after World War I, World War II, the Middle East really started to take shape as we know it today. And as conflict came, this infrastructure was chopped up based on border and war, but there still remains. And the piece was basically how you can tell the story of history through the remains of the infrastructure that was left of this train system that used to connect the region before World War I.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful thing that would be to be able to connect the region in that way.
Yeah, the same friend that sent me that article was describing, I didn't realize this, it makes perfect sense, is that the track gauge, meaning the width of tracks in different countries, are different, which makes that type of interconnected rail system very difficult, meaning you'd have to change either track gauges, you'd have to change trains. That was designed to make warfare much more difficult, that you couldn't just send your own train into someone's territory. Once your train got into beyond their border, it wouldn't function anymore. So that's all part of, I guess, this reintegration, or kind of going back, funny enough, how, we had obviously a much more interconnected and unitary system during the Ottoman period for 400 years. Obviously, things changed radically after World War I and really dividing the region in a very artificial and unnatural way. And it seems we hopefully will be coming much more full circle within that reintegration and that normalization between all these countries.
It will be a different place in the next half decade to decade. There's no doubt. As Israel signs more peace, as the peace that it already signed with Bahrain, Sudan, the UAE, as those people start to flow, as we move on from the pandemic, as trade flourishes, the region will change for the better. We'll be able to go to Abu Dhabi and Dubai on a short hop, skip, and a jump next time we go to Israel.
At this point with COVID, I just want to get back to Jerusalem, but I definitely look forward to going to these places also.
Amen.
Yeah. Here at this time, I see we have a question from the audience, or I think we do, and I want to see what we have here. We have a question for our good friend, Jeffrey Greenberg of Jewish National Fund, who says, I agree that addressing the JCPOA, the Iran deal, is most likely the first foreign policy challenge the Biden administration will take on, and it will undoubtedly divide American Jews. Should the Biden administration re-enter negotiations and work towards an updated and improved version of the deal, or continue the Trump policy of crushing sanctions and no negotiations?
I would say depends what the deal looks like. Remember what the goal of the original Obama JCPOA was, which it failed miserably to accomplish. In Obama's own words, it was to completely dismantle and prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And you can find video, speeches all over the place in his own words. That was the goal of the agreement. It did not accomplish that in any way, shape, or form. It did do some good things, there's no doubt, but it did not dismantle or prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And what it did accomplish, we didn't need to give away anything. All it did was stall or freeze the program for 10, 15 years with the sunset clause. I would remind everybody on this call that we accomplished that without a JCPOA in 2003, and I believe in 2013. 2003 quickly, or 2002, 2003, Bush is going into Afghanistan and Iraq, and Iran was scared out of its mind, to use G-rated language, that Bush was going to invade Iran. So they froze their nuclear program kit and caboodle just at the threat of invasion. They didn't need a JCPOA. We didn't need to give them $150 billion in different currencies on a runway. We didn't need to welcome them in and put our arm around them. We didn't need to get rid of all these sanctions. And then the second time we did it is when Obama, who was against sanctions for quite some time, he finally got on board on the sanction train and found that effective. They froze their program temporarily. I believe it was in 2013 based on the sanctions. So if our goal is to continue to freeze or slow them down, I would be completely against the JCPOA because any kind of agreement, because you don't need it. I would argue and advocate that if we are going to pursue an agreement that does dismantle any ambition, any hope, any chance of them becoming a nuclear power, and I'm not talking about energy, yeah, we should pursue diplomacy at all costs. But again, if it's to accomplish what the JCPOA did, no, we shouldn't be entering agreement or giving concessions to the Iranian regime to just freeze or temporarily slow them down for a half a decade or a decade. We don't need an agreement to do that. We can pull other levers.
You're reminding me when the original agreement was signed, or when it was going towards it being signed and affirmed. I think there was an article that was written by Michael Oren, Israeli historian, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, in which he talked about sort of the American mentality, sort of at the bazaar, at the shuk, and not realizing that in this region, certainly how people are psychologically wired when it comes to business, when it comes to negotiation, the ultimate power lies in the consumer. You can walk away. You have all the leverage in the world. The shopkeeper, the person who wants your money, at the end of the day, they have to meet you where you are willing to go to get their product. And so it's just kind of reminding me that when it comes to the United States position about the JCPOA or engaging with Iran on any level, but I think one thing that's also important to remember is what made the JCPOA even possible and therefore successful was that it was a huge, large multilateral agreement between different parties. This wasn't just the United States, willing to suspend sanctions or to open up, the US market to Iranian business or to the regime. This had to be done on the level of the European Union, now the UK being separate of that, China, Russia, there were different parties in play. And given what's going on in the world and how international relations have changed, multilateral agreements are not so popular anymore. They're very difficult to arrange and to implement because you have so many different competing interests that come into conflict with each other. So to find an agreement or a structure that will allow all the parties to actually be happy with what's on the table, that can be very difficult, especially where in a case like China, they very much need and value Iranian oil, while the United States, we produce our own energy at this point. We don't really care when it comes to the oil factor. When it comes to the regional dynamic of security and interest, Russia, being on the side of Syria, has more of a friendly relationship with Iran, but in some ways a competitive relationship with Iran. So all these things have to be taken into consideration. There's no way to sort of silo them or certainly to answer that question in a vacuum. It's a very complex thing. And yeah, I guess we'll have to see in terms of what those overtures will look like with the new administration as it comes to Iran on its own, but the JCPOA more broadly.
You bring up a great point, by the way. I want to piggyback on that just for a second. You can't have an effective agreement. You can't have effective negotiations without at least the European Union. Of course, you want all the other players involved, but we can't decide that we want to do whatever we want with Iran, and then Iran is a very clever country, then can do whatever it wants with the entire European Union, China, Russia. That was one positive thing about the JCPOA, is that we did have basically planet Earth on board, united in the deal, whether it was good or bad. You got to have the Europeans on board in the very least. And yeah, given where the world is at right now in our relations over there, it's going to be tricky. But it can't just be the US and Iran negotiating.
Correct. And obviously Europe is a much larger stakeholder in this from an economic perspective. They want to have access to the Iranian market. What the JCPOA sort of alleviated, or one of the reasons why all these countries were not just engaging with Iran on their own and the need for this framework, is that the United States made a clear policy that you can either have business with us or you can have business with Iran, and not both. Do you want access to the very valuable dollar or the plummeting rial? It's up to you. And therefore, countries obviously in their own interests and their own pragmatism said, screw that, I'm dealing with the United States. I don't need Iran. I like Iran, but I need the dollar. I need Washington. I need America. And so that is part of that consideration as well, or certainly what's led us back to this point. Another thing I wanted to bring up, you had mentioned as far as recent news with the Bahraini foreign minister in Jerusalem. It got me thinking also about recent news, something that we haven't seen, or I don't think has been covered as widely due to our attention on COVID, due to our attention on so many other issues going on right now. But it seems we've seen a resumption of rocket fire coming out of Gaza towards southern Israel, something that we certainly haven't seen in quite a while, or certainly not to this degree. Historically, especially in the past decade and a half since Hamas has taken over Gaza, has used it as a launching pad for terrorism through rocket fire, through tunnels. We've seen that this often follows a relatively similar script, or at least there are certain motifs that carry on between each flare up of conflict back in 2009, 2012, and 2014. Namely, Hamas viewing itself as very weak, viewing itself as very vulnerable, being cash strapped. Given what's going on with COVID, and obviously economics are difficult everywhere. In the United States, it's been difficult. In Israel, it's been difficult. I can only imagine what it's like for Palestinians given these circumstances. Combined with that, along with sort of the regional overtures of all these Arab countries being friendly with Israel, do you think Hamas is ready to start another war for their own benefit?
Hamas is capable of doing anything, and you brought up a good point. Usually, rocket fire comes when they are at their lowest popularity point. If you were to do a graph, you could almost see the correlation. To start a conflict with Israel, then people forget about how much they hate Hamas, and they buy themselves. Usually, as we saw from 2007 through 2000, it was almost every 2 years like clockwork. And as you stated, yes. Things get very bad for Hamas. They reach a low point in their popularity in the Gaza Strip. They fire rockets at Israel. And it's not one or two. As we know, the recipe usually is when you start firing about 50, 60 a day for 2 or 3 days, the gloves typically come off on the Israeli side. We're not seeing that kind of volume, but it's likely what you stated. They're how unpopular and desperate the people are. Or two, sometimes it's other factions that may see that are operating in the Gaza Strip that compete with Hamas and see how Hamas is failing and are trying to flex their own muscles. Hamas can't control all the different radical elements. So it also could be a result of Palestinian Islamic Jihad or some permutation of ISIS or whatever is in the enclave. It could be those groups launching a rocket here or there as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the things that we've seen historically is that, and it's not even isolated to Gaza, it's not isolated to Hamas or even Palestinian factions, just in the world of politics and the world of sort of competing factions. If your competition is getting more extreme than you, sometimes you have to meet them at their level. Otherwise, you are going to get eaten. You are going to have to deal with a mutiny with the rest of the population. So it's not even just Israel who may, or the circumstances of COVID that may force Hamas into certain behavior. It could be the Palestinian Authority. It could be Palestinian Islamic Jihad, like you said, permutations of ISIS. There are other factors and actors in play. So yeah, I guess we'll see what happens.
No question. So we'll see. I'm praying to God we don't have a conflict like that. Israel always comes out better than the other side, but the last thing I would want to see is destruction and devastation in the Gaza Strip. And remember, in the Arab region in general, they're not so honest with their reporting. We really don't know how bad COVID is ravaging that region. And I bet that the Gaza Strip is probably getting hit pretty hard with COVID.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, there are a lot of infrastructure issues that, at this point, we keep on saying it's coming to a boiling point, humanitarian catastrophe, even though, we haven't, even though it hasn't boiled over to that degree or what we're all anticipating and waiting for, it's still going in that direction and it's not getting any better. Whether that deals with water access, electricity access, sewage refinement, all these make up like a failed enclave, and throw in a global pandemic and a completely crushed economy. You're not asking yourself for any favors under those circumstances.
That's correct. On a brighter note, I wanted to mention Justin and I were
Yes, please, brighter notes.
I'm going to butcher the guy's name, but we're talking about Israel. Tonight's the NBA draft, and we're likely going to see an Israeli player taken at the highest pick in the draft ever. I mean, he's projected to go 4 or 5, possibly 4, to the Chicago Bulls. I'm going to butcher his name. It's Danny, right, or Denny VG or something.
I'm not as big an NBA guy, but I did see that he was a high-ranked prospect.
Correct. Anyone who wants to look it up or who watches the draft tonight, you're likely going to see a player from Maccabi Tel Aviv go in the top 5 this year in the NBA draft. It'll be exciting to see. what he can or can't do at the NBA level, but he's supposed to be a pretty complete player, and it's going to be a proud moment for Israel tonight in the NBA draft. We'll see where he ends up.
Yeah, it's funny. Most people don't think of certainly Israel with sports, or just because Israel, when it comes to sports, I think historically, like they were big in windsurfing and even judo, soccer. But Maccabi Tel Aviv is a powerhouse in European leagues when it comes to basketball.
No
I don't think they've had the same success as producing NBA talent as those in the Spanish leagues or the Turkish leagues. Whether it's like the Gasol brothers or Enes Kanter. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I guess we'll see what happens. It would be a nice spotlight there.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions, Justin?
Yeah, I was about to ask. Right now, we do not. We can start wrapping things up, but obviously, as we stated before, we want to know what you guys are thinking. If you have any questions about things that we have discussed, certainly your own thoughts that you want to be addressed about anything going on in Israel currently, or even anything that's come to mind in recent conversation or what's going on in your world, please, we want you to introduce that to this conversation. I can almost guarantee you are not the only one thinking this. That's definitely one thing we've noticed in a lot of our conversations in classes. People think that they're the only person thinking something. As soon as they ask it, they realize, you know what? Everyone else was curious about the same thing. Everyone else was dealing with the same difficulty or had the same thoughts. So I promise you, you're not alone. But while we wait for that, I do want to reiterate, I just know we had a couple of people joining a little late, that we do have some amazing upcoming webinars at Fuel for Truth that I really invite you guys to be a part of. One of them is really focusing on the bigger real story of Hanukkah, certainly transcending the very, I would say, artificial and G-rated way it's discussed in the United States. This is really to unpack what that holiday is, what actually happened, what it represents, and certainly how it has guided us in Jewish history and what we can really learn about it today, specifically when it comes to how different Jewish communities interact with each other, if not so well. The other one, which I'm really excited about, for those of you who remember me mentioning in the beginning, Valley of Tears. This is an Israeli show. I think it was released during the Chagim in Hebrew on Israeli television. Now it's on HBO Max. It is a historical drama about the Yom Kippur War. And I personally got to go to one of the bases that's up there along the Golan Heights, a few of them actually, but one of them in particular, Tel Saki, is actually used in the production of the show. So when they were going through this bunker, as I was looking through, I'm like, I've been here before. I know exactly where they're turning and what lies ahead. So we are actually having one of the Israeli reservists in the IDF who gives specialty tours up there doing a webinar with us to really kind of go behind the scenes of Valley of Tears, of the Yom Kippur War, and you kind of get a front row seat to what actually happened there and to the people that he's gotten to meet personally and the survivors and those who fought valiantly to protect the Golan border upon that Syrian onslaught in Yom Kippur of 1973. One other question here. Jeremy's asking a good question here.
Of course he is.
Yeah, I mean, what else is new? Jeremy asks great questions. No, but I know this can be difficult for someone, especially when domestic politics and the topic of Israel gets more and more sort of diluted, certainly when it becomes more of a zero-sum game of support for Israel requiring allegiance to a particular political party rather than it being either what we've tend to refer to as a bipartisan issue or a nonpartisan issue, depending on how you want to view it. Jeremy's asking, and Ron, I'll let you take this. Just, I don't know how you are registered. I'm not registered for either party, so I'm not sure if I'm qualified here. But he says, how can you be pro-Israel and voting Democrat at the same time? Because a lot of people do ask those questions, or certainly they're on the receiving end of those questions. And it can be very difficult to kind of parse together two different identities, two different values, two different interests, and what to make of that.
That's a good question, Jeremy. But I think we've gotten into the culture today of just doing broad strokes, right? Just because you want to support the Democratic Party and maybe there are certain members or even a wing now of the party that is very hostile towards Israel, that wouldn't be fair to the Democrats. As you guys know, I'm very politically active. I meet with Democrats and Republicans. And there are way more pro-Israel Democrats than anti-Israel. So it really shouldn't be difficult. I think people who are struggling with that are just reading maybe too much in, or are there issues with the Democratic Party? Maybe cause for concern. But again, look at the way votes still go down. I think it'll also be reinforced by how the Biden administration, again, will handle Israel. Now, for those expecting to be as good as Trump, like you have to understand that the way the Trump administration handled Israel, they're in our lifetime, we likely won't see an administration on that level. But that doesn't mean that every administration after is going to be hostile. There are tons, there's an overwhelming sector of the Democratic Party, moderate still, and hopefully they'll maintain their power, that are pro-Israel and that will vote that way. And these are people that I've gotten to know, I've had dinner with, been on Zoom calls with. So I understand why you're asking the question, but it shouldn't be a question that needs to be asked because, again, the overwhelming majority of the party still supports Israel. They're tougher on Israel than the Republicans, there's no question. And the Republicans don't have a sector that is straight up hostile, or let's be honest, in very few cases, anti-Semitic. But you can't take the squad or the progressive left and their views of Israel and just say, this is how the Democrats wholesale their attitude and their view towards Israel. That wouldn't be fair to the Democratic Party, and that's not fair to fact in reality. So I think we all need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and not so much focus on what may be a certain sector, and it is a growing sector, and for me personally, cause for concern, but I'm not at the point where I would feel that, my pro-Israel views would preclude me from supporting Democratic candidates or the Democratic Party in general.
After hearing
there is cause for concern.
After hearing your response, you got me thinking about this also, just because this is something that I've had in conversation with boot camp participants, other people in the FFT community, those who just reach out to me randomly, is, the way that Jeremy framed that question, what it means to be pro-Israel. I think people have a very subjective and particular understanding of what is pro-Israel, what is anti-Israel. It's not a one size fits all type of issue. It really depends what you want Israel to look like, the direction you want it to go in, what you want the outcome of the conflict to look like, what you want Israel's foreign relations to look like, meaning which actors Israel should have a relationship with, which actors it shouldn't, what type of relationship should that be? All these things are very particular and circumstantial. So to kind of broad stroke what it means to be pro something or anti something, I think is kind of a ridiculous question to begin with, just because it supposes that there's only one way to go and that I have a monopoly on the appropriate vision of where Israel should go and where we should be going. So ultimately, when you're dealing with those conversations, I know many of you have been on the receiving end of them. Really, you need to find out what the other person, like, what does that actually mean to them? What is really kind of the pain point? What is the core interest that they're trying to satisfy, that they're trying to meet through a particular policy or a particular support of a political party or a candidate? Because just to say pro-Israel or anti-Israel, I could say a lot of things that to some of you may sound pro-Israel, for some of you it may sound anti. I could say something that's going to sound very anti to some of you and pro to others. Who's right and who's wrong? The answer is kind of yes, we both are. That ultimately depends on your particular vision and how you see the situation. So I just want to leave that with that. So when these conversations happen, whether it's Jeremy talking about his experience or any of you that may encounter this, especially once the transition of power from the Trump administration to the Biden administration becomes more clear and more immediate, I can almost assure you this conversation is probably going to come up again. Try to think about it that way. Certainly give the other person opportunity to clarify what those terms mean to them. And I promise you, they will say something that surprises you, both for good and for bad, but ultimately you'll be more informed about what they are thinking about and how to appropriately address their concern or that question in general.